Hello everyone, Dr. Turner here, and I want to talk a little bit about critical and creative thinking this week because I'm asking you to do a project that demonstrates your critical thinking or your creative thinking depending on which choice you want to make. Now I want to talk about what's involved with these two different kinds of thinking so that you can basically appreciate the kind of cognitive work that I'm asking you to do. The other reason why I think this is important is if you don't know what critical thinking is, or creativity or creative thinking, you can't ask for it. And you can't set students up to do these very interesting kinds of tasks that allow them to use information in new ways or evaluate it. So when we talk about critical and creative thinking, a lot of times what we do in education is we apply the Bloom's Taxonomy pyramid. And what that is moving from lower order there at the bottom to what we call these higher order thinking skills. Now, notice it's in a pyramid for a reason. This is why we talk about higher order thinking as opposed to not higher order thinking. But the thinking down at the bottom is the foundation of that pyramid. So you don't just get a float to the top. Everything builds toward these higher levels of cognition. And the higher levels of cognition are built on what you recall, your factual recall. So what do you remember about, let's just say, Little Red Riding Hood? What are the characters, right? Where's the place? That's just factual recall. If I were going to teach you to ride a bike, I might ask you, like, what are the parts of a bike? Can you remember what a bike looks like? And you would say, well, there's handlebars and wheels, and you can ride it around, right? So that's just factual recall. Now, if I don't know those things, I can't start to do higher order, more interesting things with that information. So the next thing I have to do is comprehend certain things. And when we talk about comprehension, let's say in our example of Little Red Riding Hood, that comprehension is what happens and why, right? So it's like, okay, so she gets like eaten by a wolf at the end of that story, but why? What choices does she make that lead to that outcome, right? So notice that I have to do more than just name the characters or where they are. I have to think about cause and effect, and the same thing with my bicycle. So I have to be able to say, oh, when you pedal, it pulls the chain forward and propels the bike forward, right? So comprehension is more higher order than just remembering parts. Now notice that in schools, a lot of times we spend most of our time right here. What are the basic recall facts, and do you understand the cause and effect? But we never get to the real world. We never get to how it applies to student lives. And so we have students who get bored a lot, right? Because they're like, well, I don't know, when are we going to use this stuff? And so this is applying is where the question of relevance comes in. So if you're never getting to an application, you're doing yourselves and your students a really disservice. So applying in our story example is like, how does this story of Little Red Riding Hood like relate to me? Like, are there times you should not get off the path? Like she gets off the path and so that's bad. Like, what is the path in the real world? So that would be in a story that's like, how does that story apply? When it comes to the bike, we finally got on the bike. You don't get on the bicycle until you apply it. And so notice that as we move to these higher order thinking skills, they get more relevant and interesting and meaningful, I think. Now, analysis is where we really start getting into critical thinking. Analysis is when we start to compare and contrast. It's like, okay, how do the parts fit together? How do character choices lead up to the moral of that story? What is a moral to that story? Is it getting off the path and, or is it like being punished for smelling the flowers? Notice that we're starting to get more interesting questions here when it comes to story. But when it comes to the bicycle, we've started to take apart the pieces and leave them all around the living room floor, because now we're like, okay, how does the suspension work? And like, does it work together with the gears and the size of the tires in order to create a certain kind of ride? So analysis is looking at those parts and thinking about how they contribute to the whole. Evaluating is asking how important or effective something is. So in my story example, I'm like, is this a good story for children? Does it scare them into like Little Red Riding Hood? Does it scare them into like dallying, which might be a part of nurturing their creative selves? Do we overprotect children? So evaluating is like looking at how those parts contribute to maybe the moral, and asking yourself, like, is that important, effective? Is it psychologically sound? In our bicycle example, we're going to ask ourselves, well, is that the best bike I can have? Like, I don't know, maybe that suspension is not what I want for the terrain that I want to ride on. So notice I'm using simultaneously these two examples to try and show you what these domains look like, because as you push students toward these higher order thinking skills, they become more critical and creative individuals and more literate in terms of their abilities to think in complicated and interesting ways. So finally, if I'm creating, I'm going to take that story and I'm going to create a modern story, a better story, a new story. Maybe I'll use some of those elements, but maybe I'll think about, like, if this maybe isn't good for children in an age where we're so protective that children, like parents can't be like 5 feet away without like getting in trouble for like letting a child play in the park, what would my new story be? And if I'm not excited about how those parts work together in my bicycle, I create a new bicycle. I put a motor on it, maybe wings, I don't know. Depends on how crazy creative I want to be. And so when I'm talking about these two assignments this week, I'm asking you to work on these very upper tier, higher order skills with the understanding that I feel like you've probably got the background knowledge that you need to be able to do it. Okay, so we're going to talk about critical thinking just for a little bit longer. I'd like to delve into this just a little bit more. It has to do with evaluating the accuracy, credibility of worth of information. So if I'm looking at a website, I'm going to look at all the parts. I'm going to take them apart, look at them on my living room floor, and say, okay, what are the tabs on that website? What are the dates? What is the author? And I'm going to start looking at all the parts before I think about, how effective is it? How important is it? How trustworthy is it? That's critical thinking, and that's your question number one, should you choose that option. Critical thinking also has to do with like looking at any piece of information and being able to detach from your own biases long enough to be like, I don't know, what are those pieces, if I take the pieces apart, what do they tell me? Now notice that when we have biases, like if I don't like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I am more likely to pay attention to and believe anything that substantiates what I already think about her. So I may look at this particular meme and be like, oh yeah, she got fired from hot dog on a stick, so clearly she's incompetent. But when we invoke our critical minds, we're actually able to think, okay, I know I have biases. What makes me want to believe this and why? So it helps us spot the garbage online, and it helps us teach our students how to like back up from something they want to believe and really just look at evidence. And this is hard for all of us to do this because biases are really strong and we're emotionally connected to things. So that is critical thinking. It's looking at those pieces, being willing to look at all the parts of a thing before you make an evaluation. And so, okay, creative thinking. This is a really, it's it's our wheeling selves. A lot of people, when we talk about creative thinking, people say things like thinking outside of the box, but we honestly don't know very often what we mean when we say this. So I just want to break it down for you a little bit. So creative thinking has to do with being able to think divergently. When you think divergently, it means that you're taking the same information that everybody else has, but you're going in a different direction with it. So divergent thinking is the process of generating many ideas from a single starting point. So if you're in the middle of divergent thinking, you're going to think, okay, what if we have Little Red Riding Hood? What are all the choices she could make? And what are all the possibilities of those choices? Divergent thinking, I don't know if you can see this little graphic. It's got convergent thinking on the top and divergent thinking on the bottom. And convergent thinking is a good thing to do. It's something we do in schools a lot. It's when we get the same math problem and we get the same answer. We get the right answer. We talk about certain battles or events in history, and we all like agree on certain timelines or people who participated in them, right? So we hold certain facts about the world that we converge on, that we agree with. Divergent thinking is you have a starting point and you go somewhere else with it. So your literacy autobiographies are divergent thinking because I gave everybody the same prompt, but what happened was I got different examples, different stories from all of you. And so divergent thinking, you have to have divergent thinking in order to have creative thinking. It means starting from a central point, maybe one we've all agreed on, and now we're going into like the unknown territory. So when we think about creative thinking, it's really on a continuum. So a lot of times I'll ask students like yourselves if this is an example of creative thinking. Now, if you're like, well, yeah, because students can like put different hats, they can decorate the snowman in different ways. So there's a little bit of creativity, there's a little bit of divergent thinking, but it doesn't allow for very much. So if you think of creative thinking on a continuum, this is not really very high, right? And this isn't high at all. This is like, and we all did the same exact turkey on a plate, and we put our initial on it. And it's not that there's not a place for this, but I'm here to tell you that if we're doing this in schools, it's not creativity. So divergent thinking will often get children in trouble because I would wager this is a middle school student, so they've started with the turkey hand. But what they've started with the same starting point, but now they have like the human ready to eat it and the butterball turkey in the freezer going like, hey buddy, it's a trap. So this is what I mean by divergent and creative thinking, is we take the same thing, but then we take it in a whole new direction. How do we build something new with what we know? So your quest this week, and there's going to be more information within the module, is to do a critical analysis of a website. And I'd like you to use a framework like the Harvard or CRAP criteria in order to look at all those pieces, see how they work together, and evaluate the effectiveness. Side note, I think it'll be more fun for you if you do find a crappy website, or move to creativity, pick a picture from your photo library. That's your starting point. Everybody picks a picture from their photo library, and then you not only tell that story in 2 minutes or less, you talk about the conclusions you draw from it. Like, what do you learn? What do you take away? What's the big message? And you're going to do that in 2 minutes or less, either way. So that's your challenge. Feel free to do either one, and I look forward to your projects this week.